The summer of 1943 was the second summer of the war, and the Copper River in Alaska was working as rivers do, indifferent to what was happening on the other side of the world. Robert Callum, a field hydrographer with the United States Geological Survey, had been posted to the Copper River Basin that June as part of a federal drainage survey, work the Army needed for logistical planning in a theater where rivers and ice still determined what could be moved and when. Callum's crew of 7 men was camped near Ahtna, at a bend where the river pressed hard against a long glacial terrace, and the season had been dry enough that the depth gauges were already running below their seasonal averages. In the 3rd week of July, the water dropped. Not gradually, the way a river recedes through a long dry season, but over 48 hours, sharply enough that the crew's gauges recorded a fall of nearly 4 feet and exposed a shelf of riverbank that had not been above the waterline in living memory. Callum was the first man to walk the exposed shelf. What he found, embedded in the face of the terrace at the waterline, running parallel to the river for a distance he paced at 38 feet before it submerged back into the current in both directions, was a wall. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The wall was not a natural formation. Callum recorded this in the field log he maintained throughout the survey, a notebook now held by his grandson in Fairbanks, and his notation is careful and particular. The stones were roughly rectangular, shaped to fit, and laid in horizontal courses. Each course was offset from the one above and below it, the corner of each stone sitting over the joint of the two beneath. The same staggered arrangement a mason uses to lock a structure against lateral pressure. The surface facing the river had been worked smooth, not by water, which rounds and pits stone in a way any field geologist recognizes on site, but by a tool. The marks were deliberate and ran parallel across the face of each block. The courses were consistent in height, approximately 9 inches per course, for the full length of wall that was exposed. The face stood between 5 and 6 feet above the terrace shelf. The top course was still buried in the bank above. Callum measured the thickness where a section had cracked away at the water's edge, 22 inches. A wall 22 inches thick, at least 6 feet tall, with fitted and worked stone laid in bonded courses, inside a glacial terrace on a river that in 1943 held no record of any settlement within the conventional range of Alaskan archaeology. The color of the stone is the second detail his notes fix precisely. The surrounding terrace was grey silt and gravel, the deposits that glacial rivers build over thousands of years of advance and retreat. The wall was dark, a deep grey-green that his notes compare to the basalt found in the foothills to the north, a rock type that does not occur naturally in the terrace material at the Ahtna Bend. Someone had transported those stones to this location, selected basalt, shaped it, and carried it to a place where the surrounding geology contained none of it. The lower courses of the wall, as far as they could be traced at the waterline before the current obscured them, showed no visible erosion at the joins. The edges were sharp. The fitted faces sat against each other with contact that Callum's notes describe as closer than mortar, and there was no mortar. The wall had been assembled without binding material, which means the stone was cut and shaped to a tolerance close enough that the structure held through whatever forces the terrace and the river had applied to it across its entire history. What those forces were, and over what span of time, Callum could not determine in the field. What he could determine was that the wall in front of him was the product of deliberate construction, transported material, and a specific knowledge of how to work stone to a fitted tolerance. He had spent his career measuring what the ground contained. The ground at Ahtna contained something that was not in any map he had been given. The crew spent the remainder of that first day photographing and measuring the exposed section. Callum's notes record 8 photographs taken with the crew's Graflex camera on 4x5 film. He made a sketch in the field notebook, showing the courses, the offset joints, and the visible section lengths. He noted that the current was still running against the wall's base, and that the full extent of the structure in both directions remained submerged. His estimate, based on the depth of the terrace at that bend and the angle of the exposed section, was that the structure could continue for several hundred feet in either direction before any topographic feature would interrupt it. On the second day, the crew probed the bank above the top course, trying to locate where the wall ended. What they found instead was that the wall continued upward into the terrace, and that the material in the bank directly above it was not undisturbed silt and gravel, but compacted fill, placed rather than deposited by the river. The probing rods met different resistance at different depths above the wall, in a pattern consistent with a structure that had been built into a prepared bank, or deliberately covered rather than gradually buried by natural deposit. Callum committed this observation to the field log in the same measured language he used for everything else. He wrote that the material above the top course did not behave like river deposit. That entry is the last one in the field log at the Chitina Bend. The log continues on the following page, with entries from a site 20 miles upriver. The dates at the Chitina entries and the dates at the next location are consecutive. The handwriting on the page after the Chitina sequence belongs to a different hand, one that does not appear anywhere else in the log before that point. The reassignment order arrived by military courier. In 1943, the United States Army held administrative authority over much of what happened in the territory of Alaska, and the machinery by which a federal survey crew could be pulled from one project and dispersed across the territory without appeal or explanation was simple and fast. Callum's crew received orders that removed all 7 men from the Copper River Basin Survey and placed them on separate assignments, not as a unit, separately. Callum was sent to a drainage survey in the Matanuska Valley, 200 miles to the west. 2 members of the crew were transferred north to the Yukon drainage. The remaining 4 men went to different projects across the territory, none of them near the Copper River Basin. The field log was submitted to the regional USGS office in Seattle, as all field logs were, for filing and cataloging. What the Seattle office returned to the Copper River Survey when a replacement crew was assigned to continue the basin work the following summer was a record that contained no entry for the Chitina Bend site. The photographs were not in the returned file. The sketch was not there. The pages covering the Chitina work had not been redacted or torn out. They were simply absent. The replacement crew's assignment sheet listed the Chitina Bend as uncompleted survey work, categorized under sites requiring future scheduling. No explanation was given for why a completed survey, with field notes and measurements and photographs, had been returned without any of those materials. The field log that contains Callum's handwritten entries survived because Callum kept a carbon copy of his notes, a personal habit maintained since his first field posting years earlier, writing through carbon paper onto a second sheet that he folded and kept in his jacket pocket rather than in the shared survey case. When his reassignment papers came through and his personal belongings were returned, those folded carbon copies were in his jacket. He kept them without knowing whether they would matter. He never returned to the Chitina Bend. Years later, going through papers, he passed them to his son without particular explanation. The son kept them in a desk drawer for decades, understanding only that they were something his father had considered worth not throwing away. He passed them to his own son, who is now in Fairbanks and who, when contacted in 2012 by a researcher tracing anomalous river survey records from the wartime period, allowed the carbon copies to be examined and photographed for the first time. Those copies are the only surviving record of what Callum's crew measured at the Chitina Bend in the July of 1943. The researcher who examined them was Francis Drummond, a retired archaeologist who had spent the previous 20 years working on pre-contact sites in the Pacific Northwest. Drummond came to Callum's carbon copies expecting a mundane explanation somewhere in the detail. She pulled the publicly available geological surveys of the Copper River Basin from the same wartime period, surveys compiled by the same federal programs that sent Callum's crew there in the first place. The terrace material at the Chitina Bend is classified in those surveys as late Pleistocene glacial outwash, deposited between 12,000 and 14,000 years ago. That classification is not contested. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. For a fitted basalt wall to be inside that terrace, the wall would have had to be present when the terrace material was still being laid down by glacial meltwater, at least 12,000 years ago, or the wall would have had to have been constructed later and buried under 12,000 years of glacial deposit by some process that left the surrounding material entirely undisturbed. Callum's notes record no disturbance in the terrace material above the wall, except for the compacted fill directly above the top course that behaved differently from river deposit. That kind of fill is what a careful observer would expect to find if a structure had been partially buried by hand and then covered over time by natural accumulation. The geology above the wall and the fill above the wall are two different things. The field log makes the distinction, and the distinction is the argument. What the construction type implies is worth holding specifically. Working basalt, a dense and hard volcanic stone, to the fitted tolerance that allows a wall to stand without mortar requires tools capable of scoring and splitting the rock predictably, and the skill to use them with consistency across many individual stones over the full length of a construction project. A wall 22 inches thick, at least 6 feet tall, and 38 feet in visible length, built from transported basalt in bonded courses without binding material, represents a planned and sustained effort. Stone had to be sourced, moved over terrain, shaped individually, and laid with enough care that the courses ran level and the joints ran true. That is not the work of a few people over a short time. It is the work of an organized body with specific knowledge of the material and the method. And whoever carried out that effort did it on the Copper River in Alaska, at a time when the accepted record of this continent says no one in the interior of Alaska was building anything in stone at all, or was here to build it. Drummond's conclusion, written in a paper she circulated privately in 2014 without submitting it for publication, was that the wall at the Ahtna Bend was not explicable within the existing settlement timeline for interior Alaska. The oldest confirmed human occupation sites on the Copper River date to roughly 10,000 years before the present, and none of them show evidence of stone construction. The oldest stone construction in the broader region, across the entire northwestern interior of North America, runs to a few thousand years at most. The terrace date and the construction type do not overlap with anything the accepted record contains. They do not come close. Drummond offered no public explanation for why the paper went no further. Her subsequent published work returned to Pacific Northwest coastal archaeology. The Ahtna people have lived in the Copper River Valley since before any written record of the region exists, and their relationship to the river is not recent or occasional. They are its people in the most precise sense of that phrase, the ones who know how it moves and where it turns and what it holds through each season of each year across generations. Their oral traditions carry accounts of the landscape that predate European contact by an unknown period, and within those traditions are references to structures along the river, to places where the stone differs from the surrounding stone, where old things are revealed and covered by the water in its own time. The Ahtna describe a valley that was already old when their oldest oral memory begins, a landscape that bore the marks of people who came before them. The accounts that carry this understanding are specific. They attach to locations. They name the quality of what the river sometimes shows. The documentation that exists is partial, gathered across different periods by different collectors with different purposes, and no single archive holds it whole. But the shape of what it describes, a Copper River valley that held structures before the present record admits anyone to build them, runs through the available material in ways that do not sit comfortably against the standard settlement timeline for the region. The wall at the Ahtna Bend is in the same valley, inside sediment the geology dates to well before the accepted first arrival of human beings in the interior. The tradition and the physical record point at the same gap from different directions. Neither one fills it. The Copper River case fits a shape that repeats wherever large river systems drop unexpectedly and expose the faces of old terraces, and wherever the exposed face holds something the accepted timeline has no room for. In the spring of 1931, workers on a channel improvement project along the Wabash River in Indiana exposed a stone platform at a depth that the surrounding terrace geology placed in a period inconsistent with any known settlement in the region. work halted. A local land surveyor examined the platform and filed a report with the county office. The report has not appeared in any subsequent survey documentation. Channel work resumed. The platform is now below the regraded channel and has not been accessible since. In the summer of 1957, a gravel operation along the Platte River in Nebraska pulled a section of worked stone from a terrace deposit that state geological records date to between 8,000 and 10,000 years old. A geologist from the University of Nebraska examined the stone and issued a brief statement characterizing it as a probable intrusion displaced into the deposit by an undetermined mechanism. He did not address how a displacement of that kind could occur without disturbing the surrounding terrace material. The stone was not retained in any public collection. In the fall of 1968, a survey crew working the lower John Day River in Oregon reported a fitted stone structure exposed by low water in a basalt terrace, photographed it, and submitted their photographs to the State Historic Preservation Office. A letter arrived 3 weeks later informing the crew that the feature had been reviewed and determined to be a natural basalt formation. The photographs were not returned with the letter. The crew's written report is on file at the State Archives in Salem. The photographs are not attached to it. What these cases share is not the discovery. Discoveries in moving water happen in every season and every state. What they share is what comes after the discovery. A short window in which the feature is accessible. A careful written record made by competent people with standard equipment. And then the record moves somewhere difficult to reach, and the examining party is told the matter is resolved. Each case, taken alone, closes into explanation. A misattributed stone, a natural formation that looked worked, a wartime reassignment with no significance beyond the bureaucratic. It is only when you read them together that the closure stops being satisfying, and what is left is a shape that repeats too consistently across too many decades and too many river systems to resolve into accident. At the Ahtna Bend, the water did not stay low. The drop in July of 1943 lasted 11 days before the river returned to its previous level, as glacially fed rivers do when the upstream ice shifts. The wall went back under the current. The photographs went into a file that returned them to no one. The crew went to 7 separate assignments across the territory. And the log that reached Seattle had no Ahtna entries in it. Whatever was exposed in those 11 days is still in the face of that terrace, below the current waterline, built of basalt that does not belong to the surrounding geology, carrying its worked surface and its bonded courses into whatever span of time the sediment around it holds. Robert Callum spent the remaining years of his career on projects that had nothing to do with the Copper River Basin. He never returned to the Ahtna Bend. In a letter to his son, written sometime in the 1960s and held now in Fairbanks with the carbon copies, he wrote that he had spent his working life measuring things the record expected to find, and that he had measured one thing it did not, and that it had made everything after feel different. He did not elaborate. The letter is 1 page. It returns to family matters in the second paragraph, as though the first paragraph was something he needed to say and then set down. Francis Drummond published 8 more papers between 2014 and 2021. None of them return to the Copper River. The carbon copies sit in a box in Fairbanks, with the letter and a penciled name on the outside. The terrace at the Ahtna Bend carries its basalt courses below the current waterline in the same arrangement Callum sketched in his field notebook on the second day of low water, when the photographs were still in the camera and the full crew was still present and the record had not yet been managed. The river dropped once and showed it. The river will drop again. And the wall will be there, dark and fitted against the grey of the terrace, the same 38 feet of worked face, and the same unknown extent beyond the water in both directions, its joints still tight, and its courses still running level, exactly as they were when Callum paced the shelf in the 3rd week of July of 1943. What Callum found in those 11 days was not a curiosity to be noted and passed over. It was the exposed face of a structure built by someone who selected basalt, transported it across terrain to a river valley where none of it occurred naturally, shaped each stone to a fitted tolerance, and laid it in bonded courses without mortar and with the dimensional consistency that a trained field hydrographer could measure on both sides of a cracked section and record in numbers that did not change. Built at a time when nothing in the accepted history of this continent says anyone in the interior of Alaska was doing any of that, or knew how to do any of that, or was here to do it. That fact does not become less true because the photographs were not in the returned file. It does not become less true because the crew was dispersed before any second examination was possible, or because the researcher who confirmed the terrace age moved on without publishing, or because the wall went back below the current before anyone could stand beside it again. The wall carries the same argument in its fitted stone that it carried when Callum first measured it. The gap where the documentation should be is itself a document, and what it records is not ambiguous. Someone arrived at the Chatina Bend in the summer of 1943, found something in the exposed terrace, measured it carefully, photographed it thoroughly, and then the record of that work did not come back. What the record would have shown is still under the Copper River, inside sediment 12,000 years old, carrying its fitted basalt and its tight joins into whatever amount of time the forming terrace around it contains. The water will drop again. It always does. And when it does, the wall will be exactly where Callum left it, unchanged and waiting. 38 feet of evidence that a world the official record is entirely silent about once worked stone on this river and built something to last. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.